Wow, you're all still here. That's great. I've really had a great time these past couple of days. It's just been incredible. I think, and talking to a lot of you, I think we're all having the same feeling, just getting to meet such great people, but also so much amazing wisdom and information. So I will try not to overburden you with that, but I did not create an all guinea pig slideshow, so sorry. I should have probably after lunch. But yes, and I'm excited today to talk about podcasts with a group of people that I'm certain that everybody listens to at least one podcast at the who comes to Release Notes Conference. If you don't, I really will be interested to talk to you and find out how you found out about this conference. I want to talk about podcast sponsorship, something that I have done a lot of before I started App Camp for Girls, and some of the things I'll be talking about today apply to other kinds of sponsorship, but not so much to advertising. I'm talking about a specific kind of involvement in the business that's more community-oriented and not just like hit and run, like get your spots out there and try to mug people for attention. I'm not into mugging, although you'd be surprised. Before App Camp for Girls, I worked for nearly 10 years with these two awesome guys, Greg Scown and Philip Goward of Smile. That's us in 2006. We were very happy. We were always very happy, although we definitely, if you have a company called Smile, think about this when you name your company. We could not ever stop smiling at any trade show because, invariably somebody would go, but smile, you got to smile. Yes, I'm smiling. So I'm actually still smiling, but we're genuinely smiling there. We had a great time together working. I was a partner. I never had any specific title, but if I could have put this on my business card, that's what I would have liked to be. Enchantress of Podcasts, because it was my favorite part by far of my job. When Greg and Philip first took me on to do marketing full-time, the idea was that they would pay me to work, first part-time, then full-time, and then eventually made me a partner. But the idea was for me to figure out how to get more attention for the company, but not spend any money. And we all thought that seemed like a pretty reasonable plan. We were a small company. We didn't have big budgets for anything. And it seemed like we'd focus on PR and the tech media and bloggers and make sure that our products were covered. So 2006 was also the year that I got sick and tired of buying audiobooks for my road trips to Seattle. And I had heard about this thing called podcasts, and I went in and discovered podcasts as a source of entertainment. The first one I ever listened to was the Ricky Gervais show. I think a lot of people came to it from that. Actually, it's dangerous to drive and listen to this show. I don't recommend it. It's so dang funny. And then once I realized what a podcast was, it was free, or that one was at the time, and that it was something I could find something that I was interested in and I could listen to it whenever I wanted to, I started looking for Mac-related podcasts. And these are the first ones I started listening to. Your Mac Life, the Mac Geek Gab, and MacCast. In fact, I think MacCast was the first one after Ricky Gervais that I started listening to. And I just, did a search and found them. And not coincidentally, they turned out to be the first ones that we ended up sponsoring. But it wasn't, it actually getting into sponsorship happened pretty accidentally. I was at Macworld 2006. Seems like everything happened in 2006 for us. And I met Sean King, who's the host of Your Mac Life. If you know Sean, he's hard to miss, big guy. And I just introduced myself to him. And we started chatting, and he invited us to their party. And it was like the first party we had ever been invited to as a company. We were the newbies on the block in 2006. And Sean, so I started listening to his show and learned more about him. And about what he's interested in and what he likes. And I happened to be traveling that summer in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I knew that was his hometown before he moved to the US. And so I made a little video in iMovie of just some of the stuff that I took and said like, oh, I thought you would like that. And it's, it struck up a new conversation that ended with like, hey, how can I get you guys on the show? And we had never been on a show like that before. And Greg went on, and because at that time I really didn't know what, I wasn't the developer. I was a little afraid to be interrogated by somebody live on the air and not know the answer to a software question or something like that. So Sean had Greg on the show, and right before the show, we had this idea of like, let's create a coupon code that they can give to your Mac Life listeners to buy our software. And I think it was like 20% off. It wasn't like a fire sale or a Black Friday kind of thing. And the response we got to that coupon code just blew us away. I mean, we probably sold like 100 licenses in 2 days, which by our standards back then was a lot. And it made us start thinking like, what if we engaged with this community on a regular basis? What if we decided to sponsor the show? And I got all the information, the rate card, and I talked to the woman who managed the sponsorships, Sly Martin, and I said, could we just do one show and see if it works? And she said to me, I can tell you right now that won't work. I really, really encourage you to take at least 3. And they sold their sponsorships in 3 show packages. And it was very nerve-wracking. And we're talking only about a few $100s, but again, my mandate was to spend 0. So this was going way over my budget. And I'm so glad that she said that to me and that we went for it, because I see, in retrospect, how important it is to really support a show, not just buy a spot here or there and do it regularly. So I learned a big lesson from your Mac Life in 2006, and that pattern repeated itself. So same with Mac Geek Gab, MacCast. I listened to the show. I got to know the hosts a little bit. I liked the show. Over time, we ended up, I think we sponsored about 20 podcasts while I was there, and they've gone on to sponsor other ones since I left. But the success of each new sponsorship made us more willing to take a chance on more sponsorships. But like in the beginning, I first listened to the podcast, and I had to like it. At least that was our standard back then, was I personally had to like it because I was going to listen to all the shows. And it was important for us, for the show to be a good fit with our culture and our brand. I mean, Smile, like I said, we smile, and there's a certain tone that just doesn't mesh well. Eventually, I couldn't continue to listen to every podcast that we sponsored. Finally, reached my end. But for a long time, the first few years, I really listened to every one, and it was good for me. So we were part of that. We became part of that ecosystem and those communities because the listeners and the hosts saw that we were there on a regular basis. We cared about those podcasts and their hosts, and we promoted them in just like they promoted us. And a few years ago, I attended this talk at South by Southwest by the authors of this book, Trusted Agents, which I highly recommend. It's a little out of date, and it's a little bit like social media guru-y, stuff that I'm sure will turn off most of the people in this audience. But if you can handle it, there's some good nuggets of things to do in there. And I learned that the pattern that I had been following, so getting to know someone and their community before trying to transact business with them, was a strategy with a name, one of us. You want a potential audience to see you as one of them. And they gave a fascinating example of a guy who perfected this technique. A guy, real name was Joe Pistone, but better known as Donnie Brasco. Now, who's familiar with Donnie Brasco, the movie or the story? He was an FBI agent who went undercover with the mob He was only supposed to go undercover for like 6 months, and he ended up being in the mob-related activities for about 6 years. He was so good at getting into that community that even the FBI surveillance teams that were covering that crime family didn't know who he was. It was like he came out of nowhere. And he had a couple of great insights, I think, for everybody who wants to infiltrate a community. He started by hanging out at a restaurant called Carmelo's on the Upper East Side. And if he saw a mobster in that restaurant, he knew it was a mob hangout. He didn't just like immediately go up to them and say, hey, I'm Donnie, what's your name? I mean, it sounds like a dumb idea with mobsters, but it's a dumb idea with podcasters too. Like, when you go up to somebody and all you do, your whole like being just says, I want something from you, it's not the best way to start off a relationship. So what Donnie did, or Joe, however he thought of himself at that point, he learned how to play backgammon, and he just hung out at Carmelo's. As he said, the important thing was to have a hangout for credibility. So when I went to other places, I could say, I've been hanging out at that place for 4 or 5 months, and they could check it out. So it's important, like with Smile, we started with Your Mac Life, and we were with them for many years. We had our hangout, and people knew that we were trustworthy podcast sponsors, and that we could, we were good to do business with. I think that was very important, and it helped us meet other podcasters without running up to them and saying like, hey, can we sponsor your show? Which actually your average podcaster would probably not be too disturbed by. But we're talking about building relationships and not the hit and run thing. As Donnie BRASCO says, that's the way you build up who you are, little by little. Never moving too fast, never taking too big a bite at one time. There are occasions where you suddenly have to take a big step or a big chance, but those come later. So spending some time being patient and getting to know the people and the community that you want to be involved in, that it's going to be a symbiotic relationship, ideally, so don't rush it. My personal mob hangout equivalent was Blog World. I went to Macworld all those years, but of course, everybody went to Macworld. I would also go to Blog World because I knew a lot of podcasters went. It was Blog World and New Media Expo, which event, it went through many iterations, but eventually that's where a lot of podcasters would hang out. I got to meet a whole lot of interesting new people there. Because all the Mac people, even though there's, some 5,000 people at Blog World, we 50 Mac people all stuck together. It was just like a miniature Mac world. And I met 2 aspiring podcasters there named Katie Floyd and David Sparks, in person. And my big chance came when they launched their podcast, Mac Power Users. I listened to it like I always did, and I became a fan. And after a few episodes, I approached them with this exact email, because I never throw any email away. And because they already knew me, and they knew Smile, and they liked our products, and they hadn't thought about getting sponsorships at this point. So I actually approached them, but in, as you can see, a very softball way, to say, hey, when you're ready to do that, think about Smile. So, of course, they said, yes, we would be very ready to do that, and could you tell us how it's done? Because they had so much trust in me that they knew I wasn't going to try to rip them off or give them a bad deal, or, and they're lawyers, they let me write the contract. That was pretty amazing. So, but that's, we're talking about 3 years since, I first started sponsoring podcasts and getting to know podcasters. So I had some credibility. It was a near perfect fit for Smile, and it's my most cherished bragging right, being the first sponsor of Mac Power Users, which is now hugely successful. So, in fact, choosing a podcast to sponsor is kind of like picking your own mob hangout, and getting to know the people you want to trust, the people whose trust you want to gain, and of course who you want to trust as well. How do you find your David and Katie, and how do you make the most of your podcast sponsorships. I think David and Katie would be very amused to know that I'm equating them with being mobsters. They're the least mobster-like people I know, but and they don't know I'm saying any of this. So there's 5 important things that I'd like to review, sort of nuts and bolts, about finding and choosing and working with podcasters. The most important being the host, or the hosts in case of shows that have more than one. It is absolutely essential to find hosts who like your software, preferably hosts that already use your software. The special value of podcast sponsorship hinges on the trust that listeners place in the hosts. It's counterproductive for everyone, yourself included, if you're trying to have somebody pitch your stuff who really doesn't care about it. So just because somebody's not using your software now doesn't mean you can't start talking to them and suggesting it to them. But if it's the kind of software they're never going to use, they're probably not the right host for the podcast that you want to sponsor, because they'll just be reading a script and everybody will know it. It doesn't pay off. The next thing, equally as important, is when you do a podcast sponsorship, it needs to be long-term. Like I learned from Your Mac Life when we did that first one is definitely not enough. And you will see, if you get the rate cards from podcasters or from podcast networks, they often give the rates, per episode, but nobody buys one episode. And honestly, if somebody let you buy one episode, unless it was for something really unusual and one-off, that would be podcast malpractice, in my opinion. So you need to, I think that I would say if you're just starting out and you don't want to take too big of a jump, at least sponsor 4. And hopefully 4, depending on the podcast, 4 over 4 months. So not 4 weeks in a row. Because new people come into the audience. People don't get sick of your spot right away. They will get sick of your spots later. And you want to do them on a regular basis. There's so many advantages to this. First of all, if you sign up for more than one podcast, you're going to get some kind of discount on the sponsorship fee in almost every case, depending on how many you sign up for. At Smile, after we did our Brave 3 run on Your Mac Life, we started, doing them for a few months at a time, and eventually we just got to the point where we only wanted to sponsor people for a year, because we wanted to get the best deal they would give us. We didn't want to have to think about it all year long about whether we were going to keep renewing. There's paperwork involved. There's overhead involved in sponsoring podcasts because you want to keep track of them, and you have to pay the podcasters, and you have to keep your messages, and information flowing to them so they know what to talk about. So it's more than just writing a check every month. So yeah, we would do a year in a row. And one of the funny things that, again, in hindsight, is hysterical. Back then, I didn't realize what I was doing. But when they first started Accidental Tech Podcast, and they approached us about sponsoring, we thought, it doesn't sound like they're going to do this for very long. The name didn't inspire confidence in the longevity, not to mention that both Siracusa and Marco had already done great podcasts that they had finished. Once we found a podcast we liked, we didn't want to mess around. So we didn't sponsor it in the beginning, which obviously it turned out to not be so accidental or fleeting. I'm very happy to see how well they've done. It's like Donnie Brasco can't go to a bar and show up one time and expect for mobsters to trust him. I went to 3 blog worlds, I finally personally got sick of it myself because you can only take so much monetization of your blog discussions before, if that's not what you're doing or what you're into. Smile was at 10 Macworlds. I do recommend if you go to shows or to conferences, things where you're trying to build relationships, no matter what it is, go at least twice. Even if you don't have a good time the first time, you might have a better time the second time. Plus, you've already started to build some credibility, and you'll just waste that if you only go once. But besides the long, doing something as long-term as you can, you're going to need some kind of a budget, obviously. So there are shows that I think you could, depending on your circumstances. I used to have this rule of thumb telling people, well, try to do 4 shows for $1,000 and see what happens. But that was, a few years ago, and definitely the rates have gone up even for the smaller podcasts. There's still some podcasts in that range, but I've been doing some. Obviously, you're not going to sponsor the talk show right out of the gate, but if you can find your Mac Power users equivalent, you can grow with them. I mean, Mac Power users was relatively affordable for us at Smile when they first started. When by the time I left, they were still affordable for Smile because Smile had grown as Mac Power users had grown. But it's not a podcast I could recommend to you today if you're trying to spend $1,000 to $2,000. These podcasts, however, I did do some polling among friends and on Twitter, and my podcast network buddies sent me lists of their the shows that they had that were, I asked them for entry-level podcast sponsorships, and there's more than this. I mean, I just wanted to do one slide, but if it were me, if I was looking for a podcast today, I would start looking at some of these depending on what my product was, because they could be affordable. Again, if you decide to try to sponsor one of these shows, make sure you get the best deal. And honestly, the networks or the podcasters themselves are going to want you to succeed. So if they're going to try to make it affordable for you, maybe ask for an introductory rate, for the first 4, with the understanding that you have to go to a higher rate after that. There's room for negotiation, but as long as you respect each other, I think, and you have a common interest in the subject matter and the community that's built up around it. And I'll post this list. I'll give Joe and Charles a link. I'll make a linked list out of this so that you can find these podcasts and also contact information for other networks. The next thing that's very important is, what do you do with that podcast spot? What do you do with the message? There's 2 things you want to be able to formulate. One thing is bullet points for the host, because a podcast spot almost invariably is not going to be a straight read of your copy. If it is, it's already more like an advertisement than a podcast sponsorship spot. Most of the hosts will like to have some bullet points, even if they're already very skilled users of your product. I always sent bullet points to Merlin Mann about Text Expander, even though Merlin obviously knew a lot more about Text Expander than me. And that's kind of embarrassing, but it's cool. You can, the other thing that you're going to need, though, is something like a tagline. It doesn't have to be super clever, but it needs to be short and sweet, so that when they post the show notes, that can go in there, some short message like we used to say about, I think they still say at Smile about PDF Pen. It's the all-purpose PDF toolkit. That's good. That's about what somebody can understand about PDF Pen. Text Expander is way harder to explain to people. I'm sure there's a lot of you already using Text Expander, but try explaining it to somebody who has no idea what text expansion is about. So I used to have one tagline that I was rather fond of, which was, if you're not using it, you're wasting time. But I think there's other formulations that could be better, but you do need something that's short and sweet. So 2 things, the bullet points, the tagline, and then stick to those as long as it makes sense. When you have a new product come out, you'll want to revise your bullet points and talk about that new product. Or if you do a special deal, you might consider changing up your message. But not everybody is going to listen to every episode of the podcast you sponsor, and they may not listen to the whole thing, and you don't know where your spot's going to be. So even though it seems a little boring, sticking to one message for most of your spots is a very smart way to go. Once you have spots out on a podcast, don't just let them float out into the ether without any extra attention from you. This is a good time for you to go on Facebook, go on Twitter, a blog post or anything like that, and say, hey, check out this episode that we sponsored of, say, Mac Power users. That, first of all, you're doing the hosts a favor, and they appreciate that. You're trying to be in this symbiotic relationship. You want to promote them, for free. They're promoting you, of course, because you're paying them, but it goes beyond that if you get into the right kind of sponsorship relationship. And I really think that there's a lot of missed opportunities here that some of the big sponsors especially sort of let things just float out there, and it seems more like advertising than a sponsorship when you aren't taking a personal interest in what's going on with that podcast. When the hosts do something special or they tweet something interesting, retweet that on your Twitter feed or Facebook. I'm not as big a Facebook user, and I assume a lot of you aren't either. But some people use Facebook very successfully, and I wouldn't rule it out. And you can get creative. This was one of my favorite things that I did a couple times at Macworld. Is I thought the podcasters have an audience, and people want to see them. You know how it is. You come to release notes, you really want to see Joe and Charles, and all other speakers are great too. But you came, because you feel an affinity with the podcast itself. I thought, what if during Macworld we have some of our podcasters come? What podcasters generally don't have booths at a Macworld Expo or something like that. They're just wandering around. What if I said, hey, we'll give you the space, and you can tell everybody, if you want to come see me at this spot. And that's what we did a couple years in a row, and it was super popular. And that way, the audience came, and of course we got to talk to them too. They got to see that we really do sponsor these guys. We really do promote them and care about them. So I do think, try to think outside of the box, the way that you can help the podcast that you're sponsoring beyond just sending them checks. So of course, for sponsorship to make sense, it's got to make sense financially. We've talked a lot about that these last couple days, that you can't just ignore the business realities, the fiscal realities of what you're doing. But you won't be able to track most of the sales that are the result of your sponsorship. I'll just be honest about it right now. There's no magical way to know what somebody's going on in somebody's head when they click that buy button, short of them coming through a website or using a coupon code and coming and buying. So you're going to have to make some estimates. Coupon codes are a good way to do that. When I would start sponsoring a new podcast, I would always do a special coupon code for the listeners of that show, so that I could just see what happens when that coupon code goes out the first time on Unprofessional or the new Disruptors or whatever. And then I would have those numbers for future reference. Each time I would sponsor a new podcast, I could get a little bit of a read on how popular Smile might be with that podcast. So this was not scientific at all. There's no way to to compare them exactly, but yes, if somebody's audience went out and bought 100 copies of TextExpander in 24 hours and somebody else their audience only bought 5, I'll remember that, especially if they cost about the same to sponsor. We also had on the checkout on our Fast Spring cart, we had, "Where did you hear about us?" And that was surprisingly very successful. Although part of the problem, especially with Smile, I'm sure you can appreciate, is that at some point we were sponsoring so many podcasts, nobody could remember which podcast exactly. So the last thing was other, and people would just fill in like a bunch of names of the podcasts where they heard about us, which was great, but they didn't know. I mean, it made it hard to make a spreadsheet out of that. Also, people sometimes don't know the name of your podcast. This was a funny thing that happened with us. One of the podcasts that we sponsored that we really loved was called the Typical Mac User podcast with Victor Callao. He's a wonderful person. He retired from that podcast a few years ago, but we sponsored him for several years. And after he retired, he was still on our list because his shows were kind of evergreen. We didn't think people would stop listening to them. And it was doing so well for a podcast that wasn't even around anymore. And like after a year of this, I said, something is just not right. And so I said, let's just change that to Victor Callao's podcast. And then nobody chose it anymore. They were just saying typical Mac user, like that's what they identified, that they were the typical Mac user. So you can find out some things. You can also make some big mistakes just following your numbers. I would like to just leave you with this thought about the whole thing. This is, a good example of it. You're indie for a reason. You don't have to report numbers to a vice president of marketing. You are the vice president of marketing and the president and whatever. I had, 2 partners, so I had some level of, I had to pitch things to them, but we all felt very strongly that while the numbers were interesting and we used them every year to decide whether to renew for another year or not, we really just relied on the fact that we knew that people were listening to the podcast that we were sponsoring and coming to us from that, just based on lots of anecdotal evidence as well. So you have the luxury of trusting your instincts. And I suggest that, of everything that you've learned, this is good advice, not just for mobsters. Thank you.